next number down there is other AHS pressures. And one of the things that happens when you have a downturn like this, higher unemployment, is we've seen higher costs in a number of AHS programs. Long-term care, some of it are just related to aging and that process. TANF, welfare programs, Medicaid. We've seen in Medicaid, it's not so much cost per case, but it's more people on the participating in Medicaid. Catamount, same thing. And so we've seen upward pressures in human services, and it's in the higher, the 10 to 20 range is probably closer to the 20 side. Same thing with Medicaid, as I just mentioned, that those are now running about above the 3.5% normal growth. There's probably about another $22 million of cost in Medicaid and Catamount that we have to come up with to keep the programs where they are. So when the governor comes out with his budget in 2 weeks, you're not going to see these deficits because he's going to make a lot of proposed changes to Medicaid and Catamount and other programs to try to solve them. But in the sort of steady state world, before we make all those cuts, those are pressures above that sort of 3.5% growth rate that we have to deal with. And then you have three blue numbers that are good news. And the first is the labor contract. And you see here a number of 5.6 million savings. And the labor contract, when the governor first announced it, he said this saves $2 million. And the number of savings in the labor contract really could be anything from 2 to 12, and depending on how you count. This is one of the things. What the governor did first is he said, well, if you cut their salaries 3%, that's about 5.6 million in general fund savings. But healthcare costs are going up, and so what we'll do is we'll net off the increase of employee healthcare costs and say the net savings are $2 million. But healthcare costs would have gone up anyway, and so generally for this purpose we are starting to count it as 5.6%. That's the savings of dropping the rates 3%. The reason you could probably even say they gave more is because all of our assumptions assume 3.5% growth in spending, so they not only gave up that 3% wage, they didn't grow anything. So that would have been another 6 or 7%. So from an employee point of view, and I don't think they publicized this before the vote, I mean, they probably gave up closer to the $12 million from an expectation level. But we're counting it as about $5 or $6 million for the employees, not cutting the train. The other thing is we're getting more VSCO money, which is banking insurance fund, and part of what happened is we all made assumptions that with the downturn in the economy, people wouldn't buy brokerage licenses, there's less money in it. Turns out people, I guess, in the business just buy them, by all 50 states, and there's not, they don't sort of say, well, we won't use Vermont, even though we don't drink this, just buy it, you know, and it's, so we haven't really lost a lot in that area, and so there'll be some more money there. And the last thing is this ARA governmental services, and this is the money, it says here at the bottom, it says, governor and leadership may spend. This is where the Speaker and Senate President said, let's use $1 million to help people who are hurt by the bridge going down, and then the governor said, let's use all of it. So this assumes you don't use any of it, you just use it to help with the budget. And so one of the problems is once you spend it once, it's gone. And so this assumes it's there, may or may not be. And so if you take all those, we're up to $140 and $160 million deficit. And one of the things that happens, and this is a really critical thing, if we solve all that by cuts, revenues, anything that's ongoing permanent, it goes away. And then next year you only have 100 million more to solve. So and we'll get to that in a minute. If you solve it by one-time stuff, if you take it and use a fund or a reserve fund, or if you get $40 million from the federal government on a one-time basis, it drops up again next year. So that 100 million next year becomes 150 or 200. And one of the questions the administration says, if we just get federal funds to help our Medicaid, one-time money, let's not use it to cover this. Let's solve the problem today. But there is going to be this issue about, do we solve the deficit today, or do we push it off to 2012? And the other thing is, if you think about it, let's say you did everything right. You solved the entire deficit today, 150 million, and 100 million more to solve next year. 150 plus 100 is 250 million. That's 20% of the state budget. Over the next 2 years, you're going to have to cut spending or basically address 20% of what we do in the state budget. So so the concept there is that almost everything has to be on the table. If we took off all the K through 12 education, say that's 30% of state dollars, or if we didn't cut Medicaid, another 30% of state dollars, then the rest of the government would have to be cut 45%. And that's hard to do, courts and judiciary. And, so what you're going to see from the administration is nothing spared. I mean, it's, and one of the things I think this summer, there's been a lot of talk with leadership is just to try to have people keep an open mind that, not to set walls that don't cut this or don't cut that, because there really isn't, there's no room for that. I mean, we're really in a situation that's, that none of, well, the governor said today in the press conference, and he said, none of us have seen this in our lifetimes. It's not 1929, but it's deeper cuts than we've ever faced. It's after 2 years of fairly limited revenue growth. So, yeah.
I just add to that, Steve. I mean, I think in some cases it's not either or. People react that they don't want to eliminate a program. But when we were talking about PSG, it's really maybe there's a different way to deliver the service. So it's not always black or white or yes or no. I mean, obviously
that's really you're right. And I mean, we talk about revenue, talk about cuts. And I think the real thing that happened today that was, that I haven't talked about is the governor and the legislative leadership agreeing on $38 million worth of reductions that we're essentially doing more with less. Trying to find ways to move the focus on, if you think of a cut, saying we're going to cut money, what can you still provide services? That's a cut. As opposed to what they're talking about, which is what are the services we want to provide and how do we do it more effectively and cheaper? And so what today was announced was a $38 million of that $115 million problem, a proposed solution that calls for providing greater or equal services at lesser cost. And I think tomorrow there's going to be another workshop for doing more with less sort of throughout other periods of the budget. I think you're exactly right. There's a whole other way of how do we take what PSG tried to do. It's not going to be easy to make it real. I mean, it's obviously a lot of people that are going to see their worlds turned upside down. It's not a no-brainer. And how do we expand that to other areas of the budget? How do we sort of focus on outcomes? Do you want to have the parks open more and achieve more? Maybe we can do that in a way and make people have more access to the park at the same time having it cost less, or manage the fees or something like that. And, how do we look at, I think one of the comments that was made in the challenges today was some of the long-term care recipients who are most able, maybe give them some of the resources they need directly and let them buy the sort of package they need so that they, and not just strictly to go to this agency and maybe get services, but give the consumer some flexibility on how to go about it. And so just exploring ways to I guess the third option.
Steve, can you comment on the federal actions regarding health care?
Yeah.
How that would affect us?
Here's the health care dollar. We don't, as you know, there's a House and Senate bill. One of the things we know is the House bill does have an extension of the era for another half year for all of our FY11, which gives us about $40 million. And that's where the administration will say, don't use it for balancing this year's budget, because it just means when you come back in a year from now, and do 2012, you're not going to have to do 100 million, you'll have to do 150 million. There's also the question of the Senate bill has some extra money for Vermont that we will see in 2014, which means we have to get through 11, 12, and 13 to get to 14. And so that's good, but there's a sort of, in the meantime, we have a slight problem. The other thing that we have to deal with is that the Senate bill requires everybody receive coverage, and it's going to be really there will be no pre-existing conditions. A lot of good things for Vermonters in the sense of access to services and things like that. But from the state budget point of view, there's some anxiety because if people all